So bring it on. If you think you've got what it takes to stand up against me with science, go for it.
Okie dokie, Nephilim free. I think I can give that a go. Especially seeing as you now seem to have the backing of Conservapedia, described in the words of its founder as...
We're over 20,000 entries now. Most remarkably, we're over 41 million page views. So people are flocking to it to get information that they realize they cannot get from Wikipedia.
Millions of views. Impressive, but let's take a look at the information that you just cannot get on Wikipedia. Let's take, for instance, this. Our creationist scientist, Nephilim Free, promoted more than once on the front page of Conservapedia and praised by Conservapedians, and a genuine geocentrist.
Or rather, I'm a geocentrist. I believe the universe is spinning around the Earth. That's completely crazy, I know, but it's true.
Neph, mankind settled this one some 350 years ago with the observations of Galileo. You know, the guy who the church threatened to kill for challenging the biblical dogma that the earth was at the center of everything. The biblical dogma that dominated for 3/4 of the history of Christianity. He first observed the 4 big moons of Jupiter, instantly dispelling the geocentrist concept. You know, if things are going around Jupiter, then obviously they're not going around the Earth. Indeed, today, even with a cheap pair of binoculars, you can replicate his observations. The angular size of the Jovian moon system, as seen from the Earth, is comparable to the size of the full moon, and the moons themselves are only just beyond the limits of the naked eye. And today, with a few $1,000 worth of kit, you can do a time-lapse over the period of a night, where you can watch in real time the movement of those moons and the rotation of the planet, watching the dance of the Jovian system from the rotating surface of the terrestrial system. But there's more. We had the Galileo space probe orbiting Jupiter for just over a decade, and that dropped a probe into Jupiter, and in the process it made, for a short while, at some 47 kilometers per second, the second fastest moving object ever created by man. And on top of that, we've gotten up close and personal with those moons that Galileo first observed: Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Io is the most volcanic body in the solar system, with some 400 active volcanoes, powered by tidal heating caused by the immense gravity of Jupiter and the orbital resonance with the other Jovian moons. Europa, with its ice flows, again devoid of craters, a sure sign of a resurfacing event. Indeed, it's almost certain that Europa has liquid oceans under its surface, again created by the tidal heating by the same mechanism that heats Io. Ganymede and Callisto are significantly further out and have much more ancient cratered surfaces, and the density of these moons roughly follows their order from the planet, with the further out you get from Jupiter, the higher the moon's fractional composition of water, with Callisto being about 50% water by mass. It's a frequently pimped idea by creationists that we have the same observations, say for instance the craters on the moon, but just different explanations for those observations.
Creationists and evolutionists are trying to explain the same facts in the context of history.
And folks like Conservapedia also consider it fair and balanced to give both sides of the case.
On Conservapedia, you're going to get the other side of that. You're going to get evidence against evolution.
So what is the creationist explanation for the craters on the moon, at least from the creationist promoted by Conservapedia?
Recently I made a video discussing the evidences of the Noachian flood, some of the evidences, a few of them. And in that video I explained that the Earth split open at the mid-Atlantic ridges, which run around the Earth like the seam of a baseball, and the great pressure of the crust of the Earth, 6 miles of it, on this water, caused the water to eject from the Earth at supersonic speed. Much of this water escaped the escape velocity of the Earth and headed toward the moon, where the moon's gravity accelerated it, and the moon was pelted by water frozen from the frozen water, which came from inside the Earth at the beginning of the Noachian flood.
Oh dear. So the other side of the argument, the creationist side, is that the craters on the moon were caused by Noah's flood. Ah. Well, For a long time, you see, we've had a good idea of the energies required to escape from the Earth, and these are typically expressed as escape velocities. That is, the speed you need to give an unpowered object for it to leave the gravitational influence of, in this case, the Earth. And in the case of the Earth, escape velocities are typically on the order of 10 kilometers per second, a speed that would get you from New York to LA in less than the time it takes you to watch this video. So for Conservapedia's man to be correct, his water needs to get a muzzle velocity of about 30 times the speed of sound. Now that's a significant problem for several reasons. Most notably, only the most exotic materials can take that sort of stress. Look, even water merely moving at meters per second will happily destroy buildings and so on. Water travelling at 10 kilometers per second would cut through rock like butter. I mean, look, just to put this all into perspective, cutting water jets typically only have a muzzle velocity of about a kilometer per second. That's 3 times the speed of sound. And with a little additive, that will happily cut through steel. And Conservapedia's featured man expects to get velocities about 10 times this high. But it's worse than that. You see, so far I've assumed that there is actually enough energy available to create such a jet. Let's take a look at what Nephilim 3 is proposing. So on one side we have a massive rock falling and giving that kinetic energy to the water, which is then turning into potential energy for the water in terms of altitude. Let's assume for the moment that all of the energy from the falling rock goes into the water. A lossless conversion, no friction, a perfect system. Well, we need the distance that the rock falls.
And the great pressure of the crust of the Earth, 6 miles of it.
Great, Nav. So at the beginning we have this, and at the end we have this. Well, let's take a look at a unit cross-section. And further, let's just consider the energy that we get out of the rock mass falling this distance. So all of this junk in the middle here, that's the same at the beginning and at the end, so we can ignore it. And now our problem becomes very simple. The total amount of energy we have is the energy from this rock mass falling, and that's how much energy we can give to the water. So how far up can we throw that volume of water? Well, obviously, if it were an exactly identical unit volume of rock, it would go up exactly the same distance. That's conservation of energy. However, water typically only has about a quarter of the density of rock, which means to a first degree approximation you have enough energy to put that unit volume of water up some 40 kilometers. That's not even enough to get you into space, let alone clear of the Earth, and that's the absolute best that can be done with the energy available. But I'm afraid it only gets worse. The moon is a tiny target. It's only about half a degree in diameter, which means that if you throw a escape velocity object in a random direction, you only have about a 1 in 100,000 chance of actually hitting the moon.
These craters on the moon were caused by water that ejected from inside the Earth at the beginning of the Noachian flood, when the Earth split open. And there were meteors, ice meteors, ranging in size from smaller than a grain of sand to the size of who knows what. I mean, possibly skyscrapers. And they shot towards the moon as ice comets. It slammed into the moon. That's why the moon is covered with so many massive craters.
Okay, so the other side of the argument is that the craters on the moon were caused by Noah's flood spraying water at the moon. Fine. Well, we'll ignore for the second that there isn't enough energy available to do it, and that even if there were, it would be a very lucky shot, even if it were possible. Let's examine this proposition further. The moon is tidally locked with the Earth, something that pragmatically means we only see one side of it from the Earth. But we've sent folks and probes to look at the far side of the moon, and it's far more heavily cratered than the near side. Not really what you would expect if the craters on the moon were formed by the moon being blasted by Noah's flood. Secondly, are you seriously proposing that the other side of the argument is that craters are formed by Noah's flood? I mean, really, are all the craters on Ganymede and Callisto from Noah's flood too? But there's more. You see, the water that NASA found on the moon was in the only place where you can get water on the moon, in the frigid, permanently shadowed craters of the lunar poles. Everywhere else on the moon, water would be simply boiled off into space due to the solar flux and the low gravity of the moon. But of course, you can go further out, say to Jupiter, where there is only 1/25th of the solar flux, and there you can happily get comparable-sized moons that are 50% by mass water. Let me guess, Neff, did all the water on those other moons and all of those craters come from Noah's flood too? You see, this is the thing, Neff. Scientists test models to see if they're consistent with what we already know. I mean, let's just entertain your conservapedian creationist concept for a moment, that all the craters on the moon were caused by Noah's flood. Surely this means that we should find all sorts of desiccated sea life on the moon, whales, walruses, winkles, that sort of thing. But we've been to the moon half a dozen times. We sent geologists to the moon, and they brought back the best part of 1/3 of a ton of moon rocks, and they found no signs of sea life on the moon at all. Now I know what you're thinking. That's a horrible straw man. Surely not even Nephilim Free would be crazy enough to propose that the other side of the argument is that we should find frozen sea life on the moon. But
if NASA makes a trip to the moon and they recover some of this ice, they're liable to find plankton and bacteria inside that ice. Plankton and bacteria inside that ice.